This is the Times Television Network, and you're watching ET Now.
The decade of the 80s in my own personal life probably was major transformation. I had come back from Denmark and suddenly my whole outlook on the world had changed now. I was beginning to understand changing demographics in America. It was a totally different world. I was also very active in the telecommunication industry. I had become a major advisor into the Bell system. Government had mandated the breakup of the Bell system in the late 70s, announced in the 80s. And the decision was whether we should divest manufacturing like Western Electric, what is now called Lucent Technologies, and keep the local exchange, the baby bells, and long distance together. So we were all positioning the future of the Bell system from being regulated monopoly to a competitively driven industry. And therefore understanding how competition behaves, where competitors come as niche players, and we need to understand more and more the power is not with the regulators to decide your fate, but with the customers in the marketplace. So customers and competition becomes the focal point. And I also believe that globalization now is going to be much sooner, much faster. The trade restrictions were being lifted now because economies were not growing. There was a trade liberalization. And because of that, I believe very strongly that we need to understand how the world gets more globalized. My belief was that we need to bring people from emerging economies like India, like Africa, Middle East, Latin America, to understand where this industry is going. And in the process, we had several Indian senior executives from the Department of Telecoms, MTNL that was created, all were coming. This is an exciting time period in India in the telecom industry because Sam Pitroda had come, had appealed to Mrs. Gandhi actually in the late 70s and early 80s that India can aspire to build its own digital switch. We don't have to import things because import is so expensive in terms of balance of trade. And therefore the idea was that how can we build our own digital switch, which is called CDOT eventually as an entity. And actually India did build a digital switch very indigenous to its own rural market, dusty, etc. And it is doing quite well. And this is the time in the 80s when there was a corporatization of two large markets, Bombay and Delhi, into a company called MTNL, separated from BSNL. And the revolution of telecom was just starting, and this is strictly on the landline. A bigger revolution out of nowhere was the rise of the cellular telephone industry. The original forecast by all the experts in America were that there will be only 900,000 cellular subscribers by the year 2000. And I was involved in the beginning about the commercialization of cellular technology. Of course, this forecast was totally wrong. Today we have more than 3 billion subscribers, and the biggest market for cellular telephones is no longer America or even Europe. It is all large emerging economies like China and India. India market eventually becomes the fastest growing market. Enormous skepticism. But the cell phone technology in America was invented, there commercializes, but it loses, just like television industry. Motorola, which is a pioneer in making cell phone devices, loses its prominence to Nokia, because the Europeans suddenly realized that putting a single standard called GSM is better than allow free market process to fight for standards. And the economics of the digital age change dramatically now. and cell phones begin to transform the world of technology enormously. On the PC platform, you see the rise of Intel and Microsoft now enormously, because the two components of a PC are primarily a microprocessor and a software platform. Semiconductor industry was consolidating more and more. You had the National Semiconductor Company, you had a Motorola Semiconductor division, you have a Texas Instruments, for example, but out of nowhere, Intel was becoming the largest semiconductor maker. And on the memory side, by the way, a unknown company out of nowhere becomes the largest one in the 80s, definitely, is Samsung in the memory chips. Taiwan is getting into semiconductors at the same time. So we see now really the concentration of an industry very key to the future in the hands of the Americans is getting distributed worldwide by and large. So I think technology-wise, 80s again is a major transformative event in the world economy by and large, you know. In this era of digital age, all of the manufacturers in telecom sector are looking for outsourcing capabilities. As we install more computers, there is always need for IT support services, and suddenly Indian companies begin to rise as global players in IT software services. So the names like Infosys, Wipro, HCL, TCS begin to become global enterprises. But the journey begins in the 80s actually, you know. Very small at that time, but eventually we'll see them becoming multi-billion-dollar corporations in their own right. And I think again that is a very key aspect, because for the first time world is beginning to recognize that India has talent. In many ways, one has to attribute all this to the rise of Rajiv Gandhi. Unfortunately, Mrs. Gandhi is assassinated, and there is a void in the political scene. Rajiv Gandhi is thrust into the political scene. He was not a enthusiastic politician, but I think he was very transformative. He realized the power of the computers as a next generation younger person. It's absolutely incredible to see the story of India's in telecom sector, because at one time you had a whole problem of access to telephones. With digital switches, capacity rises enormously, and then having this STD, ISD, you know, booths out there, you can reach to the remotest part of India even on a landline system. I have a personal experience. My wife was someplace in Bihar, and she calls me from there to America, and lo and behold, I can talk to her. So rise of cell phones in the 80s is very critical. Rise of IT industry in India is equally critical, and I think those are transformative aspects of the technology by and large. I also believe that is the time when governments were deciding to liberalize a little more, and hence they were allowing joint ventures to come in. So Maruti, which was like a people's car like Volkswagen of India, begins to have the strategic alignment or joint venture with Suzuki. Hero, which is a motorcycle company, has an alignment with Honda, and today Hero Honda is the largest manufacturer of automobiles, motorcycles in the world. And Maruti has been doing exceptionally well.
Can India develop its infrastructure without the burden of time and cost overruns?
Yes, there is a role for government to play, but you can't wait for the government to actually play the role.
Presenting Achieving High Performance in Capital Projects, Securing India's Future with Infrastructure Development. A panel discussion on distinctive capabilities needed for execution of intensive capital projects. Only on ET Now. Accenture Consulting Technology Outsourcing. Accenture High Performance Delivered.
50% off on your companion's fare when you fly first or business class. Fly Emirates. Keep discovering.
The famous gateway of India. Following one of Mumbai's oldest colleges. Following, and this is the fame.
23 kmpl, India's most fuel-efficient sedan, the all-new Indigo ECS.
I think 80s is the liberalization of India. Eventually it becomes full-blown in the 90s, but 80s is where these seeds are planted pretty much. Receptivity of private sector, growth of the private sector is considered equally desirable in India as opposed to just the public sector economy by and large. In many ways, India begins to have a strong self-image. Entrepreneurs are coming out of nowhere, such as Narayan Murthy for Infosys, very humble beginnings. You see, of course, the whole Ambani family, coming and becoming large enterprises strictly on the Indian economy. So it is no longer just the 2 or 3 large domestic groups such as the Tatas and the Birlas who are doing exceptionally well, but you see the rise of dozens of other Indian corporations who eventually are going to become multinational global. I think that is again a key event in the 80s that we need to talk about. First Indian to land on the moon, Rakesh Sharma, happens in the 80s again. I think that's again a key event in terms of an episode about the change, which basically shows you that India always has been very good in the space program. It has been always good in nuclear technology. So it is capable of doing enormous things, but it was not allowed to have its own potential recognized till the 80s roughly by now. I wanted to talk about a couple of additional things which had to do with the US economy. By the time Ronald Reagan was elected as an president, and he began to allow large-scale mergers, acquisitions. Global competitiveness became his theme, and Ronald Reagan out there was wanting to actually transform the economy. And his belief system was that more deregulation is good for the country. As rapid as possible, mergers, acquisitions among big companies, even if it creates a concentration of an industry, it's quite fine. All of the tax shelters that were given as a way of not paying taxes into investment opportunities, he abolished all of them, streamlined the taxing system. Same thing happened in England. Mrs. Thatcher basically deregulated the whole economy. So we see the airports getting privatized. You might remember 2 major companies, both government-owned, British Airways, which was one of the worst airlines as government-owned. Now it gets deregulated completely because airline industry is deregulated in America and worldwide at the same time. The deregulation winds are blowing. British Telecom was the same way. They had 250,000, 250,000 employees when you really needed in a digital age with automation, less than 50,000 employees. So how do you restructure a public sector enterprise into a competitive private corporation? How do you list them on public listing? Stock exchanges was a major event. And Mrs. Thatcher apparently had the political power and a personal will to transform the economy. And I think history will prove that what she did at that time as a very serious jolt to the status quo probably was the survival of the British economy. Serious jolt to the status quo probably was the survival of the British economy. Japan continues to rise as economic power. In fact, it begins to dominate in the 80s now. Made in Japan is considered the best in quality in the world, surpasses made in America, made in Germany even, maybe made in Sweden, which are considered in quality the top in the world. Even Americans now prefer to buy made in Japan products. Japanese begin to buy out large way American corporations. Many European manufacturers like Philips and Thomson began to buy out American companies. So did the Japanese. There are Japanese companies that bought out American manufacturers like Magnavox, Zenith were the manufacturers pretty much. Japanese began to invest into capacity there, building plants, like automobile plants began to be built. But 80s is a way where trade becomes the growth engine. All the restrictions of tariffs are broken down to create economic stimulation of some sort. So decade of the 80s was massive investment into America because the policies of foreign direct investment were liberalized by Reagan administration. You were allowed to buy out a large American company if you wanted to. And the notion was interesting in the 80s that the value of a corporation, if I break it up, is more than the total corporation. In other words, the whole was less than the sum of parts. I can break up the company and make more money through private equity route than what the stock market will do. And it happened to largest of the corporations. Coca-Cola, major company, had begun to diversify into Columbia Pictures, had gone into the wine industry, had gone into the water business, and actually not doing well. So here comes Warren Buffett and becomes a major investor into Coca-Cola and turns it around, divests all the businesses and makes them focus back into the core business and begins to grow the shareholder value enormously. From a valuation of about $4 billion or so, when Warren Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway invested, in 10 years or 11 years, they made that corporation worth about $100 billion. Same thing happened at GE, but without the outside takeover. Jack Welch took the lead and basically removed all of the diversification portfolios, make it into focused companies, no more than 11, 12 businesses worldwide. And then eventually Jeff Immelt reduces down to only 3 businesses essentially, okay? While America was transforming itself through market process with massive deregulation, encouraging foreign direct investment, reducing the tax burden, tax reforms, changing the immigration policy, Soviet Union was collapsing. Soviet Union was not sustainable economically as a system. And the last push was given with the Star Wars. Ronald Reagan simply increased its defense budget at the same time to encourage Soviet Union to match so that more of the Soviet Union economic aspects will go toward the military rather than toward the markets essentially. And ultimately it collapsed. And you had the famous saying Ronald Reagan made when he went to Berlin and tear down this wall, Mr. Gorbachev, you know, as a plead, a plea that he made, and you saw the collapse of that wall, and therefore the start of collapse of communism is attributed to 1989, when the Berlin Wall was abolished, suddenly was destroyed by and large. And the East Germany and the West Germany became integrated in the process eventually. With the collapse of communism, now you see lots of civil causes in different nations rising. Breakup of Yugoslavia takes place, you know. Europeans are very worried that Europe can break up back again because Europe is barely unified in some fashion, right? There's a lot of dissension within local communities, you know. I think that's very important for us to understand, because communism aggregated all those into one common cause, but that's not the case anymore.
When Indian markets touch a new high next 12 months, to be an investor in India, you have to be an optimist. I think what is really going to remain is, I think, the resilience of the Indian consumer. There are opportunities in terms of, there are many stocks in mid cap, small cap, even large cap. Why are we again looking at next 12 months? And when is the last time any one of us predicted what is going to happen?
Catch the market's biggest experts on ET Now's InvestorCraft 2010, powered by NMIMS and BSE, only on ET Now.
50% off on your companion's fare when you fly first or business class. Fly Emirates. Keep discovering.
Hi, this is Kareena Kapoor. Hi, I'm Deepika Padukone.
Hi, I'm Imran Khan.
Hi everybody, this is Katrina Kaif.
Hi, I'm Shahid Kapoor, and we're celebrating
Zoom's 6th anniversary.
Zoom's 6th anniversary. Zoom's 6th anniversary.
Zoom's 6th anniversary with some sizzling
6 appeal.
Bringing Bollywood closer to you. 6 Appeal from 20th September.
So keep watching Zoom 100% Bollywood.
ब्लू हो या पिंक, पापा तुम तक कुछ भी हार्मफुल नहीं पहुंचने देंगे। इसलिए इस घर में सिर्फ प्योर पेंट्स, स्टेन प्रूफ पेंट्स, ताकि तुम दोनों हर रोज एक नया मास्टरपीस बना सको।
ये तो पेंट की तरह स्मेल भी नहीं करता।
नेरोलाइक पेश करते हैं इंप्रेशंस इको क्लीन, जो है बिल्कुल प्योर। अब जल्दी घर आ जाओ यार, इंतजार नहीं होता।
My own personal journey also was changing. In the 70s, I started teaching seminars, and I began to write books for the professional audience. Before that one, I wrote books primarily for the academic audience. And I wrote one book called Winning Back Your Market. My view was that markets don't abandon. Products have more life. It is the managers who give up on the products and the markets. So I began to question whether one should abandon products too soon and allocate resources from mature products to new exciting ones. My view was that you can revitalize mature products. Products have no life cycle at all, which is contrary in theory, and I was able to demonstrate how one can increase the life again and again. I was advising Whirlpool Corporation in the 80s, where we saw this rule of 3 emerge in appliances in America, which was Whirlpool number 1, GE number 2, and there was a third company which was White Consolidated, which was private equity play. We have cola wars. When Pepsi and Coca-Cola began to compete for market share, you saw RC Cola collapsed, you saw 7-Up collapsed, for example, and at the same time energy drinks all grew. So it was fascinating that this pattern was not explained by the traditional theory, and that led to evolution of called the rule of 3. my recommendation was that what is happening today among advanced countries eventually will happen in terms of emerging markets, because as emerging markets become more and more middle class formations, they will buy branded products, they will need appliances like washing machines and refrigerators, which was just emerging at that time. And therefore, companies like Whirlpool have to understand the emerging markets, which led to Whirlpool coming to India, for example, as they went to Eastern European countries, they went to Latin America as a globalization. I believe that as India gets more and more market-driven economy, you will see more and more rule of three coming. Every industry in India will eventually end up consolidating to three large players, most of them otherwise collapsing or remain as niche players by and large. My frequency of coming to India began to increase in the 80s. I became an advisor to Wipro Corporation. At that time, Wipro was based in Mumbai and was primarily a consumer care company with the typical Vanaspati business they had, and eventually they had gone into toilet soap business, Santur as a brand name. That was the reality, and since I was primarily a person in consumer behavior, that understanding is what they wanted to know. And I became an in-house advisor, which is the role I like to play. So I began to work with Azim Premji and all of the like PS Pai, for example, who was in consumer care, and I began to work with them. So every time I would come to India, I would spend a day with them pretty much. And as I came more often, my involvement in India began to grow more and more pretty much. On reflection, decade of the 80s was enormous learning for me. I mean, my visioning broadened to a level I had never imagined. But decade of the 90s, even more exciting. Decade of the 90s, you see the transformation of India altogether, what we will call as the second independence of India. Decade of the 90s is the rise of Bill Clinton, an economic miracle created in 8 years. America again begins to have enormous surplus from a massive deficit, becomes more admired nation. And the decade of the 90s is really full-blown impact of the internet. Technology massively moves very fast, and those are very exciting things we'll talk about in the next episode.
This week on the Leaders of Tomorrow series, catch the success of Raj Process Equipments and Systems Private Limited, Green Buildings India, and ECHO.
Initially, we are doing major business in India. Last 4 years, we are started exporting.
This is not a rocket science technology. We can come around and create a green building.
In ECHO, we faced various debacles because it was kind of a first of its kind.
Leaders of Tomorrow series, only on ET Now.
Brought to you by IndiaMart.com. More buyers, more suppliers, more business.
Nippon Paint. Your world, your color.
50% off on your companion's fare when you fly first or business class. Fly Emirates. Keep discovering.
When I come down from work with GE to India, the economy was just opening up across sectors, and especially restaurants. If you really look at the statistics, that 350 million middle class, 3 meals a day, or if you're Punjabi like me, 5 meals a day, that's over 1 billion meals a day.
Catch Ashish Kapoor of Your China on Leap of Faith, only on ET Now.
Presented by Bajaj Hindustan Limited, India's #1 sugar and ethanol manufacturer.
Have you ever wondered what the cost of a warm hug is? Have you ever looked after someone and sent a bill for it? Have you ever made a payment to buy a moment? Have you ever asked for a price to keep a secret? Have you ever charged anyone for being a friend? Relationships rise above money. That's why IDBI Bank is saying no charges on savings and current account services. IDBI Bank, because you mean more than your money.
जहां एक साड़ी के चक्कर में पूरे शहर के चक्कर लग जाते हैं। इसीलिए लोगन माइलेज नो प्रॉब्लम। लोगन लव्स इंडिया।
बिल्कुल प्योर।
This is the Times Television Network, and you're watching ET Now.
If the decade of the 80s was mostly restructuring the world economy, world politics, decade of the 90s was renewal, new hope, new energy. I went through the same thing in my own life. Atlanta was the next exciting city. It was growing very fast, the fastest growing metropolitan area. The airport that they built had become the busiest airport in the world. Infrastructure was put together and everybody was coming to Atlanta. So being there would energize me also. So I went to Atlanta. The decision was made that I would join Emory University. While this was happening to me, the world events were more dramatic even. Of course, we had the Gulf War, where Iraq had taken over Kuwait, and in 1991, American forces went to Kuwait and liberated Kuwait. It was the time when George Bush Sr. probably was the most popular president in our history at all. He had a tremendous popularity in America because it was the right thing to do, kind of an approach. More popular than Ronald Reagan even. But also the world admired that this was the right intervention for a nation of that kind of a great, size and scale and all that stuff. And I remember George Bush the first in that light. For his re-election in 1992, even though he is an incumbent, very popular president, he loses the election to an unknown governor from Arkansas by the name of Bill Clinton. It was like a deja vu of President Jimmy Carter winning the election in the 70s because of the Watergate scandal and the economic downturn, energy crisis and all this stuff. Bill Clinton's advisors were very smart. They had figured out that what matters to citizens when they go for polls is not foreign policy, it's not ideology, it's all about economics. It's all about jobs and wealth. And hence their advisors coined a phrase, is the economy stupid? Do your election campaign, promise us an agenda based from an economic perspective than any other perspective. And he won the election. By the way, that was happening worldwide at that time. For example, John Major loses out to Tony Blair. Mitterrand government could not have its own successor they had planned. Instead, Chirac government comes in because there was an economic transformation taking place. The longest surviving chancellor of the nation, which is Helmut Kohl, made a fatal mistake just before 90s by integrating East Germany on an equal footing with West Germany, and unfortunately it puts the whole German economy in a tailspin, and you have unemployment from nothing to 10%. Now all of a sudden jobs are all moving to the East Germany and there's a complete negativism by the people. So he loses in fact to the opposition. So that whole architecture was evolving. So Russia was going through turmoil after the collapse of communism. You had many of the Soviet bloc countries allowed to be independent. It's just like after World War II. So you have the Hungary, you have the Czech, you have the Slovaks, you have the, just goes on and on pretty much. And the Soviet Union itself is in serious trouble. If you don't make this smooth institutional transition, from a communist model of economic understanding, financial institutions, to the capitalistic model, like a stock exchange, for example, money regulation, for example, product safety regulations, etc., you always invite the mafia element. Unorganized sector takes over, and that's what happened in Russia. Till you had the Yeltsin government came in power and began to take control back again as a party to transition Russia into the modern age. While this is all happening worldwide, India is suddenly becoming into a crisis mode. The foreign exchange earnings of Indians living abroad stopped coming, especially from Kuwait. There were, I'm told, almost 450,000 Indians working in Kuwait. The balance of payment reserve had dwindled to a very small amount, somewhere around 1 billion, 2 billion kind of a thing, and therefore did not have enough foreign exchange reserve to pay for imports of all the industrial raw materials, which India is not self-sufficient. So given that, India had no choice but to go for economic reforms. IMF began to take charge, invited people like Dr. Manmohan Singh to become finance minister. Narasimha Rao, who was the prime minister, pretty much agreed on behalf of the party that both social agenda and economic agenda of India cannot be sustained by the government alone. We have to open up the private sector at the same time and let the economic agenda be driven more and more by private sector through economic reforms. In many ways, Dr. Mashelkar calls 1991 as the second independence of India. And I think he is absolutely right. While the first independence gave us the citizenship rights and a democracy, really nothing really happened. There were two strategic events in our life of India that if they had taken a different turn, India would have been a very different nation. First one was, should we become an ally with the allies, the victors, in the World War II, rather than a non-aligned movement? We would have been the manufacturing capital of the world. There would be no rise of Korea, Taiwan, and definitely not China. The second strategic, it's just happened because of the circumstances. You can't blame any leader, because those are the times that dictate what decision or judgment you make at the time, was when Mrs. Gandhi aligned with the Soviet Union in the late 60s roughly, early 70s. And that alignment is strategic military, which means once you align, it is very hard to get out of that alignment, which also made India pretty much a stagnant nation. From an economic perspective, the second independence really begins in 1991. And if you fast forward what has happened over the next 20 years or so, it's a remarkable journey. Probably better journey than what China created from 78 when Deng Xiaoping became the reformist of the economic reforms of China, for example. India generated enormous entrepreneurship. It has now created so many millionaires. It has created a personal wealth. Employment has grown enormously. World image about India has begun to rise very positively. People don't think of India anymore as a country of roaming cows and snake charmers, but they think about country of engineers and scientists and doctors. And brilliant thinkers in general, great writers of books and non-fiction or fiction books, for example. They now begin to think about top writers out of India, like Salman Rushdie is becoming a global figure now, Amitabh Ghosh, for example, is another one becoming a global. They are winning all of the Booker Prizes and the Pulitzer Prizes. All of that begins right after 91.
there are some issues which are very unique to India. Typical issue would be the availability of resources and capital equipment to create the capacity for generating infrastructure. So there's no capacity today to generate capacity to service the infrastructure sector.
Presenting Accenture achieving high performance in capital projects, securing India's future in infrastructure development. Only on ET Now.
Accenture Consulting Technology Outsourcing. Accenture High Performance Delivered.
एक्वागार्ड को सब कहते हैं पानी का डॉक्टर। पानी कैसा भी हो, एक्वागार्ड को सब कुछ पता है। एक्वागार्ड टोटल
पानी का डॉक्टर।
कॉल 39883333।
हाँ जी। Black as elegance. पेश है अयूर चारकोल रिच मॉइस्चराइजिंग शैम्पू। इसका चारकोल बेस्ड फॉर्मूला लौटाए बालों का कुदरती कालापन और बनाए चमकदार। अब 200 ml शैम्पू के साथ 100 ml मिल्क क्रीम कंडीशनर फ्री।
Another major event in the 90s was the formation of WTO. Trade would be liberalized, like Indian economy will be liberalized, pretty much. And I think the free trade flow will be good for all nations. In other words, it's more like a non-zero-sum game. It's not like your win is my loss, zero-sum, but everybody will grow, which was the old trade theory. And as you know, one of the most famous Indian professors has been Jagdish Sheth, who really has been advocating that for a long time. By the time Europe had decided to form a European Union, EC 92, in 92 there will be a full-blown European Union with complete free trade. Products can move without duties, people can move without duty, it's just one large nation now essentially. Free flow of people, free flow of capital, free flow of goods, and all the bureaucracies, etc., come down in the process. So you needed something like WTO to accommodate that. If you analyze the data as of 1987, the total world economy was primarily controlled or concentrated in the hands of only 15 nations. 12 common market countries, which are mostly advanced countries, US and Canada, and Japan. Japan is a late entrant actually after World War II even, right? Everybody was conspicuously absent in participating in the world economy. 75% of the world trade was only among these 15 nations. 70% of the GDP was among these 15 nations. So the rest of the world was not even participating in the trade. So in many ways, this enabled emerging economies to start participating more and more. By 1990s, China becomes most dominant. In fact, other nations that used to do outsourcing manufacturing work for large economies such as UK, France, Germany, America definitely, now everything gets attracted into China. China gets an enormous resource advantage, and China becomes the dominant manufacturer of the world. In fact, down the road, the largest trading partners of Japan and Korea become China, not America. Largest trading partner of Australia becomes China, not America. Most of that is through outsourcing as well as access to Chinese market, which grows enormously afterwards. The real reason for the financial crisis of 1997 goes back to 1971, when America was forced not to continue its promise of exchanging dollar for gold at $35 per ounce of gold, which was the agreement. But there is a run on the dollar in the late 60s, and President Nixon decides there is no way he can sustain that promise, and therefore he changes the whole currencies from a fixed exchange rates, like India used to be about 5 rupees per American dollar. it becomes a floating currency. That floating currency begins to compound over time in terms of commodity speculation. So Asian countries could have survived very well from that crisis if there was no speculative money that is taking the money out of the country. It's like a run on the bank. In this case, it's the central bank of the country. We had a similar crisis in North America where there was a run on the peso, for example. Similar crisis in Argentina because Argentina had pegged itself to the US dollar one-on-one, and Argentina paid America where there was a run on the peso, for example. Similar crisis in Argentina because Argentina had pegged itself to the US dollar one-on-one, and Argentina peso collapsed the same way. Under Bill Clinton, there is a renewal about innovation and entrepreneurship. Silicon Valley just explodes now. We have corporations coming and being listed either on the NASDAQ or even in New York Stock Exchange. The valuation through stock prices just begins to rise. I remember this is in the 90s where you see the rise of Indian entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley. All of a sudden the valuations of these IIT graduates who are working for HP or who are working for Xerox Labs, working for Intel, they have all gone to Stanford, Berkeley, that whole Silicon Valley eco, and the venture capital which coming in at the same time, all of a sudden creates an enormous valuation bubble. These companies are speculatively valued into billions of dollars, if not millions, when the real net worth, at least from a profitability viewpoint, would be a lot less. So they become millionaires out of nowhere. And that creates a bubble. So you have the dot-com boom of the 90s beginning, fueling the fire again. Of course, eventually it becomes a dot-com bust. The speculative nature that happened over here taught us a great lesson. That in the speculative nature of stock market, you can lose enormously and you can gain enormously, right? So trading becomes the driving mechanism, and stock market ceases to be an investment vehicle and more a trading vehicle. The decade of the 90s became the hedge funds phenomenon, and hedge funds became very speculative, not only venture capital, So you have the debt, which is speculative, and you also have, in fact, the stock market or venture, hedge funds become speculative. So that's the key problem of the 90s in the ecosystem that I'm creating, or a scenario I'm drawing for you. We allowed a tremendous freedom to financial institutions outside of the regulatory framework to invest into things that they shouldn't be investing, especially commercial real estate. Under Reagan administration in the 1980s, with liberalization again, complete wholesale deregulation, the largest institution used to be called savings and loan, which was created by America primarily for getting financing from the savings of the people for housing market, which is why America has the highest percentage of ownership of homes. It was affordable lending, essentially, right? Mortgages, systems. Well, that savings and loan was allowed to invest into corporate buildings. So we had a real estate speculation at that time. In the 80s, and the government came in to bail out, and it's called Resolution Trust Corporation, RTC was created. Reagan administration decided at that time they will shut down the banks, savings and loan banks, that are unique specialty banks, and rather than being cautious and conservative, and the cost to the nation even in the 80s at that time was $550 billion. In today's economy, that will be about $1.5 trillion.
There are some issues which are very unique to India. typical issue would be the availability of resources and capital equipment to create the capacity for generating infrastructure. So there's no capacity today to generate capacity to service the infrastructure sector.
Presenting Accenture, achieving high performance in capital projects, securing India's future in infrastructure development. Only on ET Now.
Accenture Consulting Technology Outsourcing. Accenture High Performance Delivered.
Mr. Gogol Basu is no ordinary man. There's something about him that makes heads turn. Does the cold airline food that he studiously avoids have anything to do with it? Who knows? But one thing's for sure. Thanks to his empty stomach, he certainly enjoys a lot of attention. So what if he doesn't fly India's most preferred airline?
Your neighborhood Dhobi now has some competition. It's the village laundry service on starting up. Only on ET Now.
Brought to you by Max Bupa Health Insurance. We put your health first. Seagram's Blender's Pride speaks for itself. अब पेंटिंग करने का आसान तरीका.
Technologies in the 90s, two key platforms that come about. One is the growth of cable television in India. From the old days where there was only Doordarshan, one channel, suddenly through cable technology and government economic reforms by and large, or reforms in general, opens up the whole media industry as private sector ventures. And you see therefore enormous number of cable channels emerge in India. Cable industry explodes in India, which has a tremendous impact on the content generation. Significant amount of content is created in India to the same quality, by the way, as anywhere in the world, because the biggest issue in India was not the talent of the people. There were great producers, great reporters, great directors, but the problem was we didn't have the right equipment. Now with liberalization, you can import all the equipment, whether it's the back office network equipment or whether it's the camera in front, pretty much, right? Advertising begins to grow, not just on the print platform such as newspapers and magazines, but begins to now shift toward more and more television-oriented advertising, very similar to what happened in America in the 50s with the rise of television. So there's an application of that in India now, and it could have happened a lot sooner if we did not have all of the restrictions like the license Raj. In the world at the same time, what is happening is the rise of the broadband. In other words, the narrowband pipeline now becomes broadband, primarily linked to the personal computers, the PC, which begins to shift toward laptops more and more, In India, PC is very expensive. So in India, the telecom sector begins to take the lead, especially wireless technologies, where the licenses were granted, and now you had a huge number of players in the mix. Cell phones are growing enormously, but they are digital up front. They are not like analog converting to digital like the landlines, switches, the database management, they're called BSS and OSS systems, operating systems are pretty much electronics at the base stations. The cell phones themselves are rapidly moving very fast in terms of its technology evolution. So India becomes, in a very short period of time, not only one of the largest in the world, cell phone subscriber base nation, but its capabilities are also phenomenal. Moves into the G3, G4 scenario, where I can download not only voice information, communicate, or data like a BlackBerry, but I can have a full-blown motion pictures or television programs coming live on my mobile phone. In fact, it is the decade of the 90s in India where the cell phone technology makes completely democratization of technology in the nation. Rural India, now you have access. Fishermen are going out, and getting text messaging about the prices in different places where they can land for the fresh catch, and market, mandi, essentially trading now. There is no need for a middleman in some fashion. But real leader in broadband in the 90s turns out to be South Korea and Japan. They are leading the revolution much faster, both by their private companies as well as government initiatives at the same time. So America actually is left behind. It evolves more gradually in broadband than do Koreans and the Japanese, for example. By 90s, technology has shifted its power from hardware to software. So many technology companies that grew on the hardware platforms are struggling now, such as, for example, Motorola, which was hardware-based. Software is the driver, and the two are not competencies equal. And software allows more entrepreneurship because the capital requirement is not that great, especially on an application software. Once a platform is created, you can do all kinds of applications. And you will see how powerful that is when you fast forward into the next century, where you see the iPhone that Apple creates and how many applications have come out of nowhere. Our IT industry, which had very humble beginnings, begins to become full-fledged. Out of nowhere, Bangalore becomes the IT capital of India, and being recognized at that. All foreign corporations now begin to invest their IT, R&D centers around here, such as the General Electric Jack Welch Center. The outsourcing, especially call center business, moves India. India begins to become sort of the world capital of outsourcing. IT outsourcing, IT-enabled services. NASCOM as a trade association begins to become a very lead organization, pretty much. You see now spectacular rise of all of the IT services companies in India out of nowhere and becoming highly globally competitive. In the 1990s, the foundation is laid where there is going to be a permanent shift in the next century, where the emerging markets become the driver of the world as opposed to the advanced economies. I also believe that in the emerging markets, the opportunities are fantastic with the rise of China and India, where 60% of the consumption would be unbranded products. The rise of the new middle class rises enormously, what I call center couple phenomenon in India, and that is the exciting journey for the 21st century.
There are some issues which are very unique to India. Typical issue would be the availability of resources and capital equipment to create the capacity for generating infrastructure. So there's no capacity today to generate capacity to service the infrastructure sector.
Presenting Accenture, achieving high performance in capital projects, securing India's future in infrastructure development. Only on ET Now.
Accenture Consulting Technology Outsourcing. Accenture High Performance Delivered.
Have you ever looked after someone and sent a bill for it? Have you ever charged anyone for being a friend? Relationships rise above money. That's why IDBI Bank is saying no charges on savings and current account services. IDBI Bank, because you mean more than your money.
The leaders in the solar industry today are not the same people I think are going to be the leaders in the solar industry tomorrow. And I think people with background in optical disc manufacturing are actually going to be leaders tomorrow. So that was interesting for me to be sitting on a flight reading The Economist and, hear someone saying this.
Catch Mozo Payer's Ratul Puri on Leap of Faith. only on ET Now.
Presented by Bajaj Hindustan Limited, India's #1 sugar and ethanol manufacturer.
His cutting-edge innovation has created a legacy amongst the serious listener. His achievements are music to one's ears.
So all of the company is actually music. And I must say that's been quite a change for me personally to dealing with heavy ponytail people. These are engineers, but they are musicians.
Catch Striking a Chord with Dinesh Paliwal only on ET Now.
Why is it special? Breakfast coming? Then read a case 16, philosophy. Q7, एक बार और बहुत ज़्यादा twinkle करनी बने. LED and 3D. चला.
Brought to you by Max Bupa Health Insurance.
This is the Times Television Network, and you're watching ET Now.
Being born in 1938, which means 6 decades of my life were in the 20th century, and my future life is now in the 21st century. So I have one foot in the 20th century, another foot being planted in the 21st century. I find 21st century even more exciting and more dramatic, both for world events as well as in my own personal life. This decade for USA is absolutely unexpected. With the collapse of communism in the 90s, essentially, America became a unilateral power on all dimensions. It's market power, it's the largest market in the world. European Union still is not organized. If it was, it would be the largest, but still US is the largest economy. It's enormous military power, there is no counterbalancing force, and it's enormous political influence on all of the world bodies, whether it's IMF, World Bank, NATO, United Nations agencies. I think unilateralism of United States actually became its problem, because eventually unilateralism, nobody likes it, because you are the big brother on everybody now, right? And this triggered, coincidentally, with the election in 2001 or 2000 elections of George Bush Jr. But unfortunately, George W. Bush seems like gods are not blessing him. In the month of March, Chinese have a little attack that takes place. They down the aircraft. He gets into major crisis in March. Then you have another major crisis that happens in the stock market. Then you have a major crisis that happens because of the 9/11 terrorism attack, which was of course planned for maybe a decade, but it happens under his watch. And the nation is totally shook up. 9/11 becomes a defining moment for America. Americans begin to question whether this is the right thing to happen. You have the Afghanistan war, you have the Iraq war, back again, and therefore the politics in the year 2008 becomes very interesting. Out of nowhere, all of a sudden after 2 terms, George Bush cannot continue. So now we have a Republican race and a Republican nominee, and on Democratic side the race, because there are again everybody starting fresh in many ways. You see Hillary Clinton running for presidency as a nominee, and Obama comes out of nowhere. And this 2008 election is very, very defining moment for America, because for the first time an African American becomes the president, which goes back to that civil rights movement again in the 60s. first decade of the 21st century, another major event which is becoming transformative is the economic crisis that ultimately came to a reality in 2008, I guess September, where the financial institutions themselves, through irrational exuberance in terms of lending, the derivatives model, collapsed. And you saw an enormous government intervention to bail out the banks, by and large, worldwide, investment banking banks. I think the biggest mistake America made was to abolish the Glass-Steagall Act, which was put in together after the Great Depression to separate out the insurance industry from the brokerage or investment banking industry from the traditional banks. But because of the pressure from the way Europeans are organized, which is called universal banking, American banks were insisting that they need to have everything in their portfolio, which created this whole notion of leverage, wealth management, all that stuff. And it became untenable. I think the lessons we have learned is that some form of regulation on a product called money is very important. That without regulation, free markets are not the future. Second thing that is likely to happen as a consequence of this economic crisis is that we are globally interdependent now. In other words, what happens in one place, you cannot contain in some place. It is very much like the H1N1 flu. It spreads very quickly. Or it is very much like the environment. There are no boundaries anymore. And there is nothing you can do with the globalization that began in the 90s, essentially. I think there is nothing you can reverse that process, which means global cooperation into financial regulation is going to be very important. India's destiny in the 21st century clearly seems like where India will become in the core of the world economy and world politics rather than being on the periphery. India gets globally integrated and becomes politically important nation as an economic power, as a military power, and a social power, political power, both the soft power as well as the hard power, essentially. I think 2004 election really revisits the journey that began in 1991. In 1991, reforms came out of sheer necessity. There was no choice. So we had to get rid of license Raj, just as Soviet Union had to get rid of the communist system. China had to abandon it, but more on a planned basis. But the journey begins back again after some turbulence between parties and elections in 2004. Even though it's a coalition government, it functions, just like functioning democracy. Strange bedfellows, Congress on the one hand and Communist Party on the other hand, but it is a reflection of the society in many ways. However, you fast forward 2004 to 2009, and I think re-election of Congress with a stronger Congress party itself having power base, I think is very important because it increases the confidence of the party for more bolder reforms and sooner. I believe that the major economic crisis of 2008, which fortunately insulated many emerging economies because they still had a lot of regulation, especially in the banking sector. India had the same thing. Most Indian banks were not allowed to participate in the derivatives. Our exposure was so little that actually it becomes more beneficial in India now. So this is the perfect time for more faster, bolder reforms as we can make. Okay? So I do believe that India's future will be decided partly by India and partly by the rest of the world. Rest of the world needs India as much as India needs the rest of the world. The economic interdependence and the political interdependence and the environmental interdependence are all going to increase now as India goes from an isolated domestic economy to a globally integrated economy. In other words, the days of protectionism are gone. They are just not good for the nation who practices protectionism. It's dysfunctional. So if we can actually create a investor-friendly climate, you can see the rise of India much sharper after 2020, maybe 2025, and has the potential to equalize, if not surpass, China.
This week on the Leaders of Tomorrow series, catch the success of Phoenix Medical Systems, Rajesh Fasteners and Sachi Engineering.
If you look at Phoenix products, each and every product has something unique which nobody has thought of.
Our biggest strength is our market value, our quality of product, our labor.
We cater to industry for dice, ceramic, pharma.
Leaders of Tomorrow, only on ET9.
Brought to you by IndiaMart.com. More buyers, more suppliers, more business.
Black Gazelle Beans. पेश है अयूर चारकोल रिच मॉइस्चराइजिंग शैम्पू। इसका चारकोल बेस्ड फॉर्मूला लौटाए बालों का कुदरती कालापन और बनाए चमकदार। अब 200 ml शैम्पू के साथ 100 ml मिल्क क्रीम कंडीशनर फ्री।
Analyze companies' fundamentals to pick tomorrow's winning stocks today.
It's as easy to make money in a bear market as you can in a bull market. Let me show you how. Let's make money by catching the right trend and managing risk with an out-of-the-box trading idea.
Catch them here for your daily dose of stock advice. Advice that's proven to make money only on ET Now.
In the rise of the emerging economies will lead into one more consequence that we have to understand, which is Easternization of the world now. As this is the Asian century, first half at least, things Asian will become mainstream everywhere. You might remember Rudyard Kipling, where the famous saying, "East is East and the West is West and the twins shall never meet," he was dead wrong. He's not only dead, but he's wrong also. Have you seen how Asian children in China, India, anywhere, have so westernized themselves? Not only in their dress code and lifestyle, but also in their belief systems. The generation gap in India is no more than 8 or 10 years. The older sister cannot relate to younger sister anymore. Older brother cannot relate to younger brother, right? So we already had a westernization of Asia taking place. But Easternization is very non-intuitive. Westerners are always receptive for change since the Industrial Revolution. They believe change is good for them. So the receptivity of Easternization will be faster with no resistance, but they will not adopt it as it is, they will blend it. So I call fusion. Rather than a clash of cultures and civilizations as articulated by Samuel Huntington, I believe the opposite almost, that what we'll see is a fusion. Another thing that happens is what is now called generally as reverse innovation. You don't invent over there because you have a technology and you commercialize it here in some fashion, but you invent here, you commercialize here in emerging economies like India, and you take it worldwide. Massive change. And I think that's going to be another interesting blend of the two, the East and the West. So Kipling was dead wrong. In my work in the 1990s, I was already seeing the shift from advanced countries to emerging economies, and was giving a lot of speeches and lectures in this area, how the power is going to shift from advanced economies to emerging economies, especially large emerging economies, which, as you know, in the decade of the 21st century, the famous Goldman Sachs report, not only decade of the 21st century, the famous Goldman Sachs report not only articulated but really used very good econometric technique to fast forward that by 2050 what is likely to happen. And they coined a phrase for that report called the BRIC report. Brazil, Russia, India, China as an acronym. Technically it is all emerging economies, but these four are large nations in terms of population size and resources. Technically, in many ways, it's the reverse flow. China stepping up first, India second, maybe Brazil or Russia third, and their last one. I think that report is a very seminal piece of work. And all of us are now speeding up the forecast that this transition will happen sooner than later. Why is it happening? As the world is driven more by consumer economy, you have to find out where the largest number of consumers are in population. So unlike in the 60s where population was a problem, now population becomes a great resource. So in India, for example, I have talked about the rise of the new middle class, and to symbolize it, I call it the call center couple. What's a call center couple? Two young people, both college educated, because college education is relatively inexpensive. If you get the admission, you stay at home, meet each other in college, get married, and the first thing they want to do is to have an independent household of their own. They don't want to live with their parents. In fact, parents are more a nuisance, interfering in my personal private life, what I would like to do, my independence. And the first thing they have to have is a cell phone. Every new appliance is a necessity now, like a washing machine, refrigerator. This is the phenomenon where modern retailing is becoming the mainstream in China, across more metro areas than I've ever imagined, and it is going to become mainstream in India once our laws and regulation is defined so that retailing is pretty much deregulated as an industry by and large. So it's going to happen. It's a matter of timing. The second element is very important. The demand by these two nations will be so large, not only for their own domestic markets, but both are becoming major sourcing places for the world. Manufacturing will equally grow in India, not just in China, as a second sourcing place. And I see in many industries, especially the Japanese and the Koreans, investing massively in manufacturing in India, and also into the infrastructure industries, as we build infrastructure. And if Japanese and the Koreans come, the Europeans will come, because they're all global competitors, and the Americans will come.
Spanning the verticals of real estate development, we strive to develop destinations. We are Oberoi Realty, developing destinations.
One more thing that happened to me, even though the journey began in 90s, but actually it came in terms of fruition was in 21st century decade, first decade, was a most insightful question I have been ever asked by any CEO of any company in the world was, why good companies fail? And that one was by Dwayne Ackerman, who had by that time become the CEO of Bell South. I had gone to Atlanta, became the advisor to the company, and in one of those conversations he simply said, Jag, which is my name in America, Jag as in Jaguar, said, Jag, why good companies fail? I had never thought about that one. I thought companies never fail. So I said, I don't know the answer, I don't know, but I will do research. And I did my own research, and I found most companies don't fail by competition, as the theory goes. It's called constructive destruction, competition as a force, which is capitalism in some fashion, but they destroy themselves. And among the 7 bad habits, original title of the book was going to be 7 Bad Habits of Good Companies, as a takeoff on Stephen Covey's book about 7 good habits of effective people. And I began to articulate and do research. The most dangerous habit is denial of new realities. Of course, you have the arrogance, you have the complacency, you have turf wars within a company, family disputes, which basically destroy the company while the family is fighting against each other. But the real most dangerous and the most non-obvious is denial. And so I began to research, and I found interesting case histories. Here is the founder of Intel, Ken Olsen, who creates a world-class company called Digital Corporation, competing against the almighty IBM in the mainframe mini computer business. $1 billion or more revenue even in those days. 25 years later, destroys the company by simply refusing to accept that personal computers can do the job of mainframe computers, with affordability of personal computers dropping by 100 times at least. He simply believed a PC is a Mickey Mouse. It's a toy. It's not a real technology. See? It's the way you are trained as a scientist and an engineer comes to haunt you now. So that was a denial. So I have created a framework, and ultimately the 7 Bad Habits book was written in terms of what's called the self-destructive habits of good companies, and of course how to break them. It's a leadership book, and it has a very simple message that the CEO of tomorrow will have to become more and more like a medical doctor. The key thing is to diagnose the disease. Diagnosis is the most important one, nothing else. In the decade of the 90s, broadband came in place. Internet became almost universal or a necessity. Cell phones, which are digital technologies, also became a necessity. Fast forward now into this century, and what you see is the phenomenon of social networking. It began peer-to-peer communication. It began, of course, with Napster as an illegal device to download music or software and share with each other. But now as social networking or Internet 2.0 or Web 2.0, whatever they call it, is a phenomenon. I think the impact of social networking, whether it's a Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter now, for example, it will be more massive than the invention of television and the cell phones. It is going to radically shift the power base altogether. From institutions having powers over individuals, it will be the individuals having power over the institutions as a fundamental shift. And the news will go out very fast. Content will not be created by commercial entities, like the newspapers and the television, etc., or the movies, but the content will be generated by users themselves. Especially digital products to create content are so affordable today. I mean, today I can get a digital camera of as good a quality as almost professional in the hands of the masses. You have democratized technology. So I can take pictures, I can take movie shots and put it there, and that content, user-generated content, is massive. So now how do you organize that content? Just like libraries organize content. Storage becomes very key. So you see the rise of companies like Google enormously now. Advertising changes dramatically now because a marketer would like to go where the consumers are. So now how do you fast forward advertising dollars into social networks? And how do you do it right? Becomes a very key opportunity essentially. My view is that it is inevitable. You can't fight it. This is the stage again that denial habit may come in the way. So if you are a media company, if you are an ad agency, you must participate into social media as they have done successfully with the rise of the television and of course mobile marketing, as we have done with mobile telephones. We do transactions, messaging, that banks and the airlines do it. So how do we fast forward that and do it properly would be a major impact. Surprisingly, social media will be no longer just advanced countries first and emerging economies later. They will all converge about the same time. In fact, the largest broadband in place today, or the internet in place, is in China. It surpassed America in terms of billions of subscribers or the users into the internet. And as that happens with India, it's a matter of timing more so. So you will see that the emerging economies, whether those are in Africa or here, gets equalized. And social media becomes very key as a trigger point for that. And I wish I was born 30 years later so I can enjoy the aspirations and the challenges of the 21st century.
Foundation was started by my father. He is really somebody who's been working very hard for educating the girl child. And we have around 41 schools around the Rajasthan district, backward districts where it's very hard for girls to be educated.
Catch Kudat Simran Lal on Leap of Faith, only on ET Now.
Presented by Bajaj Hindustan Limited, India's #1 sugar and ethanol manufacturer.
In Singapore I made, everything's designed around me. Fast cars, fashion, I can get it all in a flash. Not that flash. The food's amazing, 24 hours a day. And so is the party. This is my Singapore. Come make Singapore your own at yoursingapore.com.
पैसों से खिलौने खरीदे जाते हैं, दोस्त नहीं। इसीलिए तो आईडीबीआई बैंक ने चार्जेस हटा दिए हैं, सेविंग्स और करंट अकाउंट के भी। आईडीबीआई बैंक, क्योंकि आपके पैसों से बढ़कर हैं आप।
Mrs. Godbola's love for her husband Chandu has only grown with time. You see, every time he comes home on a late night flight, he skips the cold airline food and she gets to cook up a meal for him. All his favorite dishes made with loving hands and served with a gentle, flourish. So what if he doesn't fly India's most preferred airline?
क्यों रोक रहा है? क्या हुआ? तू बाहर थूकेगा? तू क्या कर रहा है? तू मेरी चीज पे थूकेगा तो मैं तेरी गाड़ी में थूकूंगा। अब हाईवे तेरा कैसे हुआ यार? इस हाईवे के बनने में मेरे भी पैसे लगे हैं। क्या? ज्यादा नहीं, लेकिन 2-3 किलोमीटर मेरे हैं। अरे आराम से यार, पानी पी।
प्रगति को अपना बनाइए, इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए। IDFC